You don't worry about it.
I think that really this is an opportunity for you to.
You can close it up. It's all right. We'll just.
Okay, for you to discuss.
Yeah. So let me
resolution.
I'll just kind of remind the board what the agenda item essentially is. The purpose is for us to talk about how the public participation aspect of further consideration of 3 and 4, and we've talked about this, hit on this at several meetings the last couple of months, and then our background information is essentially going back to on December 8, 2009, we adopted a resolution acting on the conceptual master plan for the Bowling Creek Greenway. The resolution specified, quote, that staff be directed to establish a process for public input on phases 3 and 4. And so in November, we expressed our interest in discussing the matter, and facilitation of a public input process on this topic has been suggested. The possible identification of particular resource materials and strategies is anticipated as an outcome of the work session. So, board members, we're kind of opening up the door here to just talk about how we proceed with public participation on phases 3 and 4. So, Jackie.
This has turned out to be a really divisive issue in our community, which is how fortunate are we that the most divisive issue in our community has to do with surface materials and alignments and bikes versus feet versus whatever. Like how lucky are we? We could be Flint, we could be Ferguson, we could be Baltimore. So I'd like to encourage people in their arguments and in their advocacy to take it down a notch. There's a lot of bullying on both sides around this issue, not from this board, but out in the community. And come on, folks, I'd like the conversations to begin with. We all met with Andy to talk about it. There is no money for this at the moment. There's no money for it. So let's be real careful about getting in there. And we get all these ideologies around trails through the woods, and we get all this who's more environmentally sensitive, who's more forward thinking, who's more this and that. Let's tone that down, because there's nobody in this community that wants to destroy the environment. There's nobody in this community that doesn't think that trails are a good idea. We're debating over issues having to do with alignment and how close to the creek and right-of-way and surface areas. We're not debating if this is a good idea. And I think there's a little bit of too much ideological purity out there at the moment, which I think, given what's going on in the country as a whole right now, we need to look at. I think we're all being polluted by this ideological purity that's being thrown at us from the far right and the fear that's permeating things, so everything becomes, and I don't want to see our trail system, our greenway system, or whatever you want to call it, through Bowling Forest, divide us. That's ridiculous. We have so many things that are pulling us together. And we all agree on the ends. It's the means. So I would like the public process not to start with this group standing up and saying that the world will end if we don't do this 5 miles or however many it is of 10 foot wide and 16 feet of clearing rail, that we're responsible for the end of the world. I don't want another group coming up and saying you're killing all the forest creatures, because that doesn't get us anywhere. That buys into the Trumpism that's going on in our country right now. I'd like the public process to start with a common vision, not a common vision of where exactly or what materials are, but what do we all kind of want for this, without going into too great detail, and with remembering that we have a whole lot more in common than not in common, and how very, very, very privileged, to use a word that's used a lot now, how privileged we are that this is our main problem. This is one of our main problems. So let's have somebody that'll help the community get together and say, how would you like people to go through Bowling Forest? Not how you don't want them to, not specific widths and surfaces, but how do you see going through Bowling Forest?
Okay, thank you. Bethany?
So I think I ended up not talking to Andy because the week that he was doing his interviews, I wasn't available. And it didn't matter because I really did trust, folks to be able to sort of surface what the issues are. And, I think that the charge that, the question at hand is actually not how to go through Bowling Forest, but is how to achieve a common goal, which is creating a north-south route, essentially. And so I think I'd want to just extend your comments that in fact, let's not lead with that question, because the question is really how do we want to navigate Carrboro from north to south? And I know we have some options on the table. We just didn't choose whatever those, the best route. And then I think since those routes were suggested, maybe some folks feel that there ought to be other alternatives. I think, and I don't have any comment on that, but I think that that's where we need to be real careful about structuring a process. We've got a greenways plan that does have an informed vision. We have a bike ped plan that has an informed vision. Those two things meet somewhere. And so we need to be real careful about making sure we go ahead and encapsulate what we already know, the work that's already been done, that's already been informed by a very diverse community, but perhaps not diverse enough, and make sure that we frame the right questions that we need to advance, so that we end up with a solution. Whatever the questions are, there are a solution to those questions. So, we need to get there. I also want to just say that if we're going to bring folks together, I don't think it's about bringing different groups together. I think it's about bringing people to the table that traditionally have been engaged, but making sure that we have room at that table and actively pursue populations that normally aren't at the table. I don't mean people, individual people that normally don't speak. I mean populations. And I would include young people who move around on their bikes and on their feet differently than adults, and particularly differently than adults with high levels of skills. And I would say we need to engage people that have mobility issues, that have some options to use a bus to get to here from there and whatever, but still have some gaps. And I think we need to be really deliberate about engaging the neighborhoods to the north that sometimes don't view themselves as part of the system of Carrboro. And in fact they are. And this is really either going south to north or north to south. It's really about that connectivity, and we need to really understand what the appetite is for that connectivity now and how that differs from maybe when it did back when we weren't able to make this decision. So,
thanks, Bethany. Good comments. Randy?
Well, I agree with everything that's been said, and I'd add that it's not just about connectivity. It's also about the natural environment and having the great treasure of having a urban forest in our midst, which is an unbelievable gift, and how we recognize and protect that. So connectivity on its own, I think we need to define it instead of having a very broad concept of it. Connectivity between neighborhoods is not necessarily, street by street, is not the same as talking about through the forest. And we know that. And we know that the consultant's report is the consultant's report. And we know that there's a lot of questions about who actually weighed in at the time. So there's a real need, as you said, Bethany, to be more inclusive and really look at how we broadly engage community. I think preliminarily, at the get-go, we need to create an opportunity for a common ground discussion, much like when we had the Greenway Summit in 2005. And we were talking about what do we want in greenways. I think we need to go back to square one on that, because I think that's a way that we can have conversations that engage the public. We did the Greenway Summit at the Century Center, and there was like 150 people. Well, every single session on the consultant's report for the Greenway, if you added it all up, it didn't add up to 150 people. So I feel like at this time, because there's new neighborhoods to the north, because we realize that we need to have a broader base of input, that we recognize that the place to start is creating common ground conversations about these two values that we have. One, which is connectivity and getting that identified for this particular space, which is very different than anywhere else in town. And the second is looking at the natural landscape. We talk about open space. We talk about the value of having green spaces. So this is not just a conversation about connectivity. It's also this value that we hold very dear, that we want 40% open space, and yet here we have 250 acres, and that can't be lost in the conversation. It is the conversation. And so I think we need to figure out how we want to initiate common ground conversations to start. I think Andy, in his conversations with us, kind of lent that idea to a direction we could kind of feel things out and then move from there. We do not have the money on hand to do anything. We might as well lay a course that's very thoughtful and mindful of the fact that this is controversial, but it's also an opportunity for the folks in the community to see where they do have common ground first, more than thinking about how they may be divided.
Okay, thanks, Randy. Other board members, Michelle and then Sammy? Would you?
Just to add to what, Bethany and Randy just said, I think there's another value, which, because the most recent discussion we've had about this is from the Climate Change Task Force. So perhaps that was encapsulated in what you were saying about connectivity, but I didn't hear it. And so I think it is protecting the environment. I think it is getting people to bike and walk more, right, which is going to mitigate some of what we're seeing with climate change, and the connectivity piece that you mentioned. And I have a question, and I told Andy this when I met with him. Given that there is no money for this, I am mindful of the timing of a public process and how long I don't know how long the process will take, but I know people have very strong opinions about this, and I think I'm interested in common ground. I think it's going to take some time to get there, if we can even get to that space. So I just think timing's important, because if we're not going to do anything about this right now because we have no money for it, perhaps we need to anticipate when we would pursue funding for this and shape a public process around that, or connect it to it, because this could go on for 5 years, a public process, and
Yeah.
so
Let me-
I want us to consider timing.
Thanks, Michelle.
Barbara, we can go longer than that.
We could,
Yeah.
just
Can I-
not get people all riled up about it when we're not doing anything about it right now.
Sammy, can I
Yeah, exactly.
respond? I'm going to respond to that before we go on to you. Michelle, timeframe, that's important, I think, and everyone here's touched on that just a little bit. I think we're all in agreement that we want to do this in a thoughtful, inclusive manner and get lots of input. I mean, I know I do, and I assume everyone else does. As you say, there's no money out there hanging on a string waiting for us. So I really want to hear a lot about it. And whatever we do end up doing, I want to make sure that we also think a little bit outside the box, okay? Because I think sometimes, we think of the box of the, 12-foot wide cemented state mandated path, and it might be that, I just want us to think broadly about just, all kind of ways that we can kind of work toward this issue. And I also want to make sure as part of whatever process we have, that we not only include our community, all the stakeholders that have been mentioned, but other stakeholders that are just as important, like UNC and OWASA and everyone. I want us to, as part of this entire conversation, I think obviously there are people that need to be included. So I just wanted to follow up on that. Sammy?
Well, I'm glad we're finally having this conversation. I feel, unfortunately, one way in which for some to maintain what they like is to maintain the status quo, and for too long, I feel that's been accomplished by, for the board, for example, by kicking the can down the road on when we would have this direction that we gave to staff addressed. I'm glad we're here today and that we're finally going forward with it, and that it started in such a good tone. I think that that the one thing that we have experienced, like one thing that I have experienced in the process until now, is a lot of how shall I say this? Preempting of discussions that could possibly serve to justify one way of thinking about an alignment. And I think that is contrary to the spirit of really trying to get the best information of what the various reasons for the various alignments are, to thereafter have a good discussion. I hope that the spirit that has driven that strategy or tactic is in the spirit of what Jackie was speaking of, diffused and let go of, to allow for us to, as adults, have a conversation and tap into the reality of this not necessarily having to be a lose-win situation. So we've all kind of done some work tonight, just setting the tone. I think that goes a long ways. But I'm also very interested in hearing about the nitty-gritty of what that process is going to look like. I'm just putting that out there. I don't have any good ideas exactly for what that would be. But my spectrum of what's okay includes town public hearings, and I think that we've dropped the ball as a board in not wanting to face our responsibility as board members and as a body when making difficult decisions and managing the community as we have those discussions. And so and I'm not disparaging of it, but we've subcontracted out a lot of times, maybe too much, I feel, like the mediation aspect of things. And I think that there is an opportunity to do things within the form of what government traditionally has been in a way that is more constructive. So I just want to put, that's one side of my spectrum. On the other side, I do see the value of mediation, but I'm also curious to hear of other parts of that spectrum.
Thanks, Sammy. Good comments. Okay, I think Damon?
Thanks, Lydia. I guess a couple of thoughts come to mind as I'm hearing people speak. The first is I'm interested in and fascinated by the conversation around, well, there's no money out there, so we have this sort of undefined kind of timeline or sense of how that would happen. I think, like most capital projects, really the idea of there not being money out there is really, that's a decision for us to make, right? In other words, we can make a decision whether to pursue funding or not.
Yeah.
It's not as if that just kind of happens. And so I just want to put that on the table, that we can identify priorities and decide whether we are going to go after funding and make local match available, but that's up to us, right? So the sense in which there's no money available is really just one way of saying that we've decided there's no money available right now because we have a lot of work to do before we get there, right?
Right, but also I think knowing we can't get it tomorrow, it would have to be an MPO timeline and all that, right? Yeah.
The second thing that comes to mind as I'm listening is, I think one of the things I think I was hearing Bethany say, although I don't want to put words in your mouth, Bethany, but is being very careful in whatever process we undertake to not lose sight of the work that has been done to this point. And so I'm holding that in one hand, right? And in the other hand, I'm holding what I think was one of the things that Randy said, which is a kind of willingness to kind of, let's go back to some first principles, let's find common ground, that kind of thing. And I guess I think there's a spectrum there that we need to figure out where we sit a little bit. And so for one way of thinking about it, for example, is, okay, we do have this Greenways conceptual master plan for the Bowling Creek concept plan, and based on the decision that was made about that plan in 2009 for phases 3 and 4, we've got these 3 alternative alignments, right? So that's kind of where we are from a policy perspective. We've adopted this plan and we've said, we're not going to make a decision about the alignments in phases 3 and 4 because we need more public input, but these are the 3 alternatives. We're going to keep them all on the table for now. Now, I'm perfectly happy to enter into a public input process that holds on to that and recognizes all of the input that went into that, the work that went into that in the community and the staff, but to also see what are the other ideas to put on the table, right? I don't feel wedded to those 3 alignments, or without having a fuller conversation about what the rest of our transportation network looks like, what the rest of our what the other values people hold around preservation of urban forest land or green spaces or open spaces and so on. So I think we need to figure out where we're comfortable saying how far do we want to stray from the policy that was adopted in 2009 and consider new information and consider what other possibilities might be. I don't really have an answer to that. I'm just kind of throwing that out there because it's something that came to mind as I heard both Bethany and Randy kind of speak what I thought were sort of on 2 ends of that spectrum around recognizing where we are with our existing policy statements and recognizing where we could be if we threw other things into the mix. And I suspect we would all be comfortable being somewhere in the middle of that spectrum, along that spectrum. So when I came into this conversation or into this meeting tonight, knowing we were talking about this, I guess I was going back to the original language of the 2009 decision, and it says, staff is directed to come up with a process, basically. And so I also just want to end by saying that I'm going to be looking really with a lot of interest and in what staff thinks a really strong public input process would look like. And does that involve outside facilitation? I'm hesitant to call it mediation.
That's not what it is. It's not.
Facilitation, because mediation implies something very different to me. But what does staff think that would look like? What is from the staff's perspective, what is the ideal public input process for a project like this? What does that look like? And what are we willing to bear in terms of putting the resources into that? How do we be as inclusive as possible and all of those things, get all the values out on the table? Again, I don't have an answer to that question, but again, that's why I would be looking to staff for some guidance and professional expertise around how to do that. Does that mean we hire a consultant? Does that mean we do it all in-house? Does that, whatever. So those are my thoughts.
Thanks, Damon. Bethany?
So yeah, I
I'm
think
sure I
that-
may have misstated something. you said.
No, you were right on. I feel like there's room for gut checking, for a few gut checks, right? Not going back to ground zero around certain issues, for sure. And I think that allows for space to, raise new things if needed. I also wanted to sort of piggyback on what you said about funding, Damon. And I think we all recognize we don't have the money now, but actually finally, making some decisions or putting some framework around what a project or multiple projects look like would allow us to, and staff to be creative about funding moving forward. And it may not be the MPO. I mean, you never know when that next president decides his or her thing is going to be to fund something, So we need to be ready, and we're not. So let's get ourselves at least in a better position to be ready. And then the final thing is that, facilitation is very different from mediation. I think we need to get beyond our thinking about what a mediated process looks like, and think about the kinds of skilled facilitators, if we're going to have any kind of facilitation at all beyond our own leadership as the board and our own staff leadership. There's always great reasons to have some kind of outside facilitator or somebody to help set up the exercises, somebody to help us think creatively and outside the box about how to get public input, but not to be the consulting, the tool. We need to hear it all. We ought to be active participants in that facilitation. But I think it's possible to draw on expertise that we have right here in the Triangle to help us do that, whether it's at one of the universities, at Triangle J, at any number of sort of, neutral organizations that can help a government figure out how to ask the right questions to get the quality kinds of information we need to make decisions. So I'm all for facilitation. I don't think it ought to be the Dispute Settlement Center, because we're not trying to settle the dispute. We're trying to come to decisions about some things that really require, I think, a little bit more creativity and process than we've had lately. Yeah.
Okay.
I just wanted to follow up about the money part, and I'm not saying we need to have Dispute Settlement Center do this, but they do more than mediation. They do facilitation. So maybe they're not the right fit, and maybe they
I think that's all I'm saying, is that
I just wanted to clarify that for folks. Not
Yeah.
you all, but maybe other people who weren't
Yeah, we have
clear
them at
about
our
their
retreat.
services.
Yeah, I find them a very good fit.
But the other thing I want to say, my comment about the money is that I think timing is important, because when I've heard from people who are concerned about, have various concerns, it's as if we are going to start doing something tomorrow on the land, right next to the creek. And so I just think timing's, and we're not. And I think we do need to have this discussion about prioritizing, so we direct when we pursue the funding. I think my question is about how much time we allow for a public process, because people already have very strong opinions about this. And again, we have made no decision around this. So, I mean, we've made some, but as far as moving forward with what type of surface will be there, which alignment, we haven't made that decision, where the funding is going to come from. So I just want us to be mindful of how long we allow for the process and when we start it, given that we have.
No, those are good points, and I'll summarize some of the questions that we have here in a minute. Randy?
Yeah, Michelle, I'm glad you brought that up, because I think one of the things that we need when we consider timing to look at 3 and 4 is 1B needs to be finished. Sewell School Road needs to be made viable. Sidewalks, the bike lane needs to be completed, because without that, and without the metrics on the use, we're just not clear on what really does need to go potentially north to south. And I say that because there are assumptions being made about the use and potential alignments, that we won't have that information until 1B is complete and actually used, until Sewell School Road becomes more viable, because right now, it doesn't have sidewalk all the way through, it doesn't have bike lanes. And as somebody who, has biked my whole life, I will tell you, the number one way that people get around on bikes, because it's transportation, is on the roads. So without looking at the full landscape, we're not doing justice to a discussion of potentially 3 and 4. We just need that information ahead, just like we need information on the viability of the Wilson Park Trail and the use there. So, and looking at the use of other trail areas that are completed. And I just say that because we're making assumptions about what greenways will do. And if we're going to build them, we need to have the metric. We need to have the information on its use and who's actually using it, where are they connecting, and how is it being used. So I would say that should be part of the timing question.
So part of the, it seems to me that part of the information that would be gathered, presented, discussed during these, whatever we want to call them, summits, workshops, whatever we have involved in the community, it seems like that would have to inform the discussion. I know, so 1B might be finished sometime next year, but the sidewalks, right now there's the sidewalks on Sewell School Road are, I think, years out, and they're not even funded. So but we could certainly have conversation toward knowing that they're in the plan in some way. I don't think you're suggesting hold off until those are built, because
No.
not.
I'm just saying that
Having that
we
be
would
part
need
of
to
the
priority.
right.
You mentioned priorities. That would be a priority ahead of the forest.
But
It
it
have
would be
to be.
part of the
It's consistent with how we do everything in this community.
Okay, did I see a hand up over here?
Sure.
Yeah.
All right, well.
But you sort of asked the question, which was, I was a little bit unclear,
Yeah.
Randy, when you were talking, were you saying that you thought that substantial bike path improvements on Sewell School Road would need to be in place before we would even engage in a process to make decisions about phases 3 and 4 of the Bowling Creek Greenway?
I think that we'd have to know that that's in the pipeline, that's a priority that precedes, because
But isn't that kind of...
nowhere else in town would we consider doing something interior before we did it on the road. I've been here a long time, and we've always done bike lanes on the road first. And to me, it's inconsistent not to make that part of the planning process.
Well, I think that definitely would have to be part of the conversation, because it already is, and also it's something also that's really not our jurisdiction. It's Chapel Hill. So it's something we've been working with Chapel Hill on for years, kind of trying to include it in the MPO
But the whole
plans.
idea of building 1B was so that it would connect to Sewell more easily. So Sewell has got to be completed, more or less.
So you are saying that you think Sewell School Road improvements for pedestrian and bicycle mobility would have to be complete
Well, I
before we
think-
would even move on making any
I think
decisions
we-
about
I
phases
think
3
we
and
need
4?
to
I think
move-
that's kind of shocking. I'm actually shocked to hear you say that.
But doesn't it make sense? That's the whole
No,
reason.
I think that's exactly the kind of conversation that needs to be part of this public input process.
But then why do we-
You're assuming that everybody agrees with that particular
Then why do we
assumption
build
you're
1B?
making.
It's like a bridge to nowhere if there's
Part of the
not,
Greenways plan.
no, but it has to have a connection. It's got to have the sidewalk, and it's got to have a bike lane. Only part of Sewell School Road has a sidewalk. It's inconsistent with any other place in town. when when the Francis Shetley Bikeway was built, it connected two sets of sidewalks.
It is certainly the case
It
that
connected-
Phase 1B serves, one purpose of 1B is to connect people from Homestead to Sewell School Road. That's absolutely the case. But it is not only the case that that's true. If you look at the adopted conceptual plan and the various alignments that remained on the table after that decision was made in 2009, you see potential connections between 1B or the school property and potential alignments of a path going through the Carolina North Forest. Now, whether we would end up ever doing that is a question, but again, to me, that's the purpose of having a public input process, is to determine what people's values around that are, and what decisions we want to make about where regional funding, transportation funding would go, whether it's to Sewell School or it's to something else. I mean, I never thought we would be ending up having a conversation about actually completing pedestrian and bicycle improvements on the entire length of Sewell School Road before we would have a conversation about public input on phases 3 and 4. That, to me, you're talking about, a decade or more pushing this off.
Well, I'm not saying that we couldn't have the conversations. All I'm saying is that folks understood, the community understood that 1B was to connect to Sewell, and the expectation is that Sewell would be brought up to the standard that the rest of the town is in terms of bike lanes and sidewalk.
I think there's a fuller, I think there's a fuller conversation to be had about that rather than us
Maybe
sort of
so.
assuming things about
I think-
people's
yeah.
Maybe
positions.
so, but I want you to realize that when decisions were made about 1B and the community input we had, the reason why folks were so interested and willing to, for a wide variety of folks, a very broad spectrum of folks were interested, was because they saw that would be a way to make that connection.
Okay, I have Bethany and then Sammy.
Well, Sammy, I think, had his hand raised before.
Oh, okay. Sammy, go ahead.
This gets to what I was getting at before. I know there's been, and even the discussion of which alignment of 1B was in part strategized in how to diffuse any pressure on 3 and 4. So the idea by some that if you connect the Sewell, then the pressure to have connectivity through the creek would be released. I agree with Damon. I'm not wanting to have that conversation here. I think we're here to really get a public process understood, a process through which we can better hear from both sides of this conversation and thereafter make a decision on how we want to go forward. I'm wary of postponing until sidewalks on Sewell get built. I want to be alive and
She didn't say that. Bike lanes.
or bike lanes. I don't think I would. I don't think I'll see it in my lifetime, really, whatever the decision ends up being. But I think that it wouldn't hurt, though, to look at, like you do with any other alternative analysis when you build significant infrastructure. Like MLK, they looked at the rail corridor, when they looked at bus rapid transit, the rail corridor, and these alternative analyses of how some alignments are more conducive to having people achieve a certain goal than others. But in the process, we're identifying our common ground, what those goals are, and thereafter we will ask of staff or consultant or whoever it may be, what are, given these options that we're looking at, which ones rank highest on each metric, is one way to conceive of how we might go forward. But I don't want to predetermine the time frame given certain senses of where the community's perspective is when we haven't even had that process to gauge that first.
All right, I think I'd like to suggest that we come up with language for a resolution directing staff to kind of take a lot of the fine points here that have been raised, right? Coming back to us in the fall and identifying what type of a forum could be one that would be inclusive of a lot of the questions that we talked about, starting with some of the ones that Jackie had and informed by comments from others, such as including some plans we already have, but yet being open to, kind of conversation among many, many stakeholders. And I think, I don't know, Mr. Manager, I'm sure this board would like to maybe see a process at least brought to us in the fall. I know I would. Now, whether that process would begin in the fall or spring, I mean, that's up to staff workload, I think, because I know once we start on this, it'll be pretty intense. Yeah, it'll take some time, but I think that's kind of what I'm hearing. I mean, I don't know how if someone else wants to.
I had a couple of comments.
Damon, then Bethany, and then, okay.
I was
Sorry.
on the list.
Oh, I'm sorry, Bethany was next. I'm so sorry.
No, that's okay.
Just hit me on the head.
It's the, and I was sort of hoping to head in that direction too, in terms of giving some direction to staff, like maybe all of our comments at this point could be directed in that way. I guess I'm hearing, I really appreciate Michelle's concern about sort of time frame, what we're really talking about. Maybe we're not really talking about an intensive process, but rather sort of a stair-step process, something that, settles some questions first, then, gets to some shredding or some, different ways of getting input from different populations and so on and so forth. So I think a phased process of some sort would be really great, and I'd love to hear what staff would come up with. And I don't think it has to be 6 months. Doesn't even necessarily have to be a year, but we do have to be mindful that, we just went through a situation where there was a 7-year process of something with lots of public input, and then people thought that, we could reopen the doors again, and we wanted to, but gosh, that created a lot of tension. So anyway, we don't want that. So let's learn a couple lessons from this last go-around. And then in addition to thinking about a phased process, maybe one of the first steps would be actually coming up with a succinct some options for questions that we, what's the goals of each of those phases and the questions that we really want to answer. And I think everybody raised one or two here. This was a great sort of microcosm of the discussion, I think, that's happening out in the community. So we have to narrow those down, though, given that we don't want to start at ground zero again. And then finally, I'd love staff to come back with a pretty exhaustive list of the stakeholders that we're really talking about, or how we make sure that table is a really rich, diverse table that we're creating, or that we're that is attractive enough for many people to come and sit at with us. So I'm thinking things like, looking at neighborhoods, specifically in neighborhood objectives, and trying to flesh out who's got particular objectives, age groups, race, socioeconomic stature, of course, municipality or government institution. I think we have some crossover, particularly given what's happening with Chapel Hill or not happening with their transportation plans. Chapel Hill Transit, major anchors like the university, obviously, but I'm sure there are others that I'm not thinking about, school groups, et cetera, and really help us think through how to reach out, how to engage, but also reach out so that we can engage effectively with all of those stakeholders. That would help us, I think, sort of start to build a framework that's a little bit easier to get our arms around.
Okay, thanks, Bethany. I had Damon, I think, next.
Yeah, I think I'll skip over most of what I was going to say, because I think Bethany instead has provided a thoughtful way to think about moving forward. I will just say that I suspect that one of the things we'll hear back from staff in the fall is, well, we're in a new budget now, and so we obviously didn't plan for the coming fiscal year, right, for a public input process, whether it's staged or not, right? So this is something that we'll be having to plan for in the subsequent fiscal year in terms of how to pay for a process. So just wanted to acknowledge that I assume we're not expecting you to go back and amend your recommended budget for us that we're about to adopt in 2 weeks. So.
Okay, great.
I have one question.
Yes, Mr. Manager.
Something that you haven't brought up, but I just want to make sure that at the staff level we get it right. And that is, leading up to this meeting, there were several requests by task forces, boards, and commissions to have this conversation about a north-south corridor or Boland 3 and 4. And we basically said, no, what happened in '09 was that the board was going to take up the conversation. Should staff still assume that the conversation is limited to the Board of Aldermen in contrast to other boards and commissions that might want to start talking about this?
I just think it makes sense. I mean, that's the
To link
direction.
to the board.
Yes, to this board. I mean, that's the direction we've given before, and I think it's almost counterproductive to do otherwise, I think, because we're going to engage the whole community.
Just for clarity, that's all I'm looking for.
Thanks, Mr. Manager.
No, thank you for asking.
Any other comments or questions? So do we need a resolution kind of summarizing that, or should we just ask staff to, did you make a resolution?
Do we need a
need it?
resolution?
Do
or
we
just
have enough
We could draft
direction?
something and circulate it for comment.
Yeah, the other piece
Over the
that
summer.
we haven't talked about was, that we were asked to address tonight, was resources. And I know that we've sent lists of resources to staff. If you could have that in the notes for next week, the full list, that would be great.
Okay.
And if there's resources that we see that are missing, we'll send it in.
Okay.
Make sense?
All right. Any other comments, board members? Okay. All right, so our last item, I believe, folks,
We have two last ones.
Family success.
I'm sorry, I meant appointments. I know the OWASA, and I think Kathy has our ballots for the.
So can I actually ask,
Talk about OWASA.
did we do anything differently this time around to reach out to potential candidates, and particularly to try to get people of color that have the right right
Direct
skills?
emails were sent to the directors of empowerment, IFC, El Centro, and then Nate also sent it out in an email blast to all of his nonprofits.
And I had
that
conversations
was
with people at the NAACP and others.
Yeah, that is much better. It's disappointing we're not able to get at least one application from a person of color, and I'm wondering if we could just try one last time, if this term isn't up until the end, give it another week or another 2 weeks, I guess, or
Board members, are you fine waiting a little bit on that, or? It doesn't matter. I mean, it's fine with me. It's up to the end of June, right?
And the reason I think it's important is because we are losing a person of color on the board. It's not, and it's Carrboro's appointee. So that's that board needs diversity, and we're responsible for helping to get it there, and when we're losing it, I think we need to try.
It's all right.
So.
Let's delay it. Let's delay
Okay.
it just maybe.
May I put a request in? If you
Yes?
spread the word yourselves,
Yeah.
please send it, tweet.
And if there's no other application, that's fine. But
When are we closing that?
Well, it's.
I can wait until the last meeting of the month.
Yeah, let's wait on this, the OWASA.
So the
one,
28th.
last
Yeah.
Tuesday, that's fine, yeah. And all of us can make another last concerted effort there to.
Yeah.
Thanks for doing that.
Thank you, Bethany.
All right.
Thanks
and
for your
then-
patience about that, yeah.
So then our last matter, the Family Success Alliance appointment, I think that I would entertain a motion to appoint Damon as that.
Oh, really?
Would you entertain a motion appointing you?
I was hoping somebody else was going to do it. No, I'm actually really interested, but I also am,
Or if anyone wants it, I just knew you were, but if anyone else wants, it doesn't matter.
it's fine, but maybe could we have an alternate also? I mean, I don't know, is there
I'm
somebody
willing to be an
else?
We should always, I think we should always have alternates, so.
Mainly because I just don't know right now what they're intending in terms of frequency of meeting.
Right.
And I have a number of other appointments that are on my schedule, so I don't want to be over-committed any more than I already am.
Is that agreeable with everyone to, let's see, have.
Can we have, is there a volunteer to be an alternate?
Both of us volunteered, but.
I'm happy to, if you want to.
Okay, so
great.
a motion for Damon for the Family Success Alliance and Michelle to be the alternate is made by
Me.
Bethany, second by
Sammy.
Sammy. All in favor, say aye.
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 Opposed, matter passes unanimously. Motion to adjourn.
Thank you.
Move adjourn.
By Michelle, second by Damon. All in favor, say aye. Okay, yeah. Oh, okay, sure.